Welcome everyone to the Climate Action Plan presentation at Audubon Naturalist Society. My name is Denise Guitarra and I'm the Maryland Conservation Advocate for Audubon Naturalist Society, or just commonly known as ANS. We've been around the region for a long time, 124 years, and our mission is to ensure that DC area residents enjoy, learn about, and protect nature. So we're really thrilled that tonight Adriana and her team have joined us to talk more about and go more in depth of what the Climate Action Plan is, how you can get involved, and what the timeline to get involved looks like. So it's really my pleasure to have Adriana and her team tonight.
Thank you so much, Denise. Good evening, everyone. I know it's quite a chilly and windy evening out there. I usually try to go for walks early in the morning, and when I saw that the wind chill was 16 Fahrenheit this morning, I just stayed cooped up inside. Thank you so much, Denise, for hosting us this evening. You and ANS have been great partners in our climate initiatives. You were a very active participant in our transportation work group, so thank you for that. And I will be joined this evening by two of my colleagues from the climate planning team, Stan Edwards and Doug Weisberger from the Department of Environmental Protection. So just bear with me a moment while I proceed to share my screen. Okay. So in mid-December, the county released the Draft Climate Action Plan, or CAP, as we like to call it. The CAP is Montgomery County's strategic plan to cut our greenhouse gas emissions community-wide 80% by 2027 and 100% by 2035, and to reduce our climate-related risks. This is an integrated plan that looks not only at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also identifies strategies for the county and our residents to become more resilient to a changing climate. The plan identifies the county's largest and growing climate hazards, and it identifies 87 prioritized actions covering 7 sectors: clean energy, buildings, transportation, adaptation, carbon sequestration, public engagement, and governance. And those 7 sectors are outlined here in the plan. We have identified our vision for building a healthy, equitable, and resilient community with vision statements for each of those sectors. The plan reflects our fundamental values as a community, and developing the plan, we were guided by these principles listed here. In particular, I want to underscore the second item, which is to advance racial equity and social justice. And to us, that was a central pillar of our plan. And we'll go in depth during our presentation about how we have sought to incorporate racial equity and social justice into every action that we take. Engaging residents, businesses, and community organizations was key in developing our plan. I recognize several members here in the audience today who participated in our climate planning work group, so thank you very much. We had 176 community volunteers participating, met dozens of times, and came up with close to 900 recommendations for the climate action plan. The draft CAP reflects the input that we received from the community. And we had members representing public, private, and the nonprofit sectors participating in the climate planning process.
Racial equity and social justice, as Adriana said, are central to the CAP. And although all county residents will feel the impacts of climate change, certain groups will feel these impacts more acutely. And the CAP focuses in on this, quote, climate gap, in which certain segments of the population, such as people of color and low-income communities, are disproportionately affected by climate hazards and have the least resources and less ability to anticipate, cope with, and recover from them. There are a number of maps in the CAP that highlight this, and the recommendations seek to address these vulnerabilities. The map on the left, our consultant spatially mapped CDC Social Vulnerability Index to highlight areas in the county where we'd anticipate residents are more susceptible to the detrimental impacts of climate change. The map on the right shows the energy burden in the county. Red shaded areas indicate census tracts where the average energy costs are 3% or greater of households' income. And this is a real concern. If we're having increased number of high heat days and folks have a high energy burden, there's going to be that wrenching choice between running the air conditioner or dealing with the intense heat to save money. And on the heating side, we know that heating oil is more costly and dirtier than electric heating. And colleagues in our Department of Health and Human Services who manage the African American Health Program have told us that they've heard concerns on the part of some elderly Black residents in some communities who are on fixed incomes about this very issue. The solution is converting to cleaner and more affordable heating to enhance health and equity. Of course, that then raises the issue of upfront costs associated with making the conversion. And we try to capture these types of issues in the equity enhancing measures for many actions throughout the CAP. So here's an example of what we mean by an equity enhancing measure. It's hard to read over here, but it says B2, that's one of the actions, electrification code requirements for existing residential buildings. You probably can't see it, but under co-benefits, there's a very negative score for racial equity and social justice because the costs associated with electrification conversions could impact the availability or price of affordable housing, and the cost could be passed on to renters. So we flag this in the shaded box there, suggesting prospective measures to ensure that we're not exacerbating inequities. And so some of those bullets are like provide subsidies to low-income households to make the conversion, develop awareness campaign in multiple language, focus on accessing financial incentives. And while there was some diversity among the 5 work groups Adriana mentioned, the goal of making, we felt that it was insufficient and did not fully represent the county's demographic makeup, and it did not sufficiently reflect leadership among organizations that focus on racial equity and social vulnerability. So back in September, we expanded our engagement with many community-based organizations focused on public health, racial equity, civil rights, immigrant communities, seniors, low-income communities, to get broader and more diverse perspectives to help shape the equity enhancing measures, ground truth priority actions, and to identify blind spots. We also launched a Resilience Ambassadors program this past summer with 5 young adults in high school and college, which we designed with the same goal in mind. And this chart here summarizes some of the key issues and priorities that were identified. You can see there are a whole host of issues that might at first blush seem outside the realm of climate change, including things like lack of health and flood insurance, traffic safety, disincentivized landlords, mistrust of government, language barriers, neighborhood segregation, etc. But the fact of the matter is that climate change is a threat multiplier that not only touches everything, but makes everything worse. So we've tried to convey throughout the CAP the need for integrated solutions that address climate change, equity, health, and the pressing quality of life issues that our residents are facing. We're really talking about systemic change.
Thank you, Doug. In the CAP, there is an entire section devoted to the major climate hazards and climate vulnerability in the county. The CAP identifies the 4 largest and growing climate hazards, and they are extreme heat, extreme precipitation, high winds, and drought. The CAP analyzes the impact of climate hazards on a variety of community asset categories, including the built and natural environment, as well as people. And this is the concept of climate vulnerability. In the next few slides, I will briefly share a few of the many maps and figures of climate hazards and climate vulnerability that were developed for the CAP. Together, they give us a sense of the localized impacts that we can expect to see here in Montgomery County from climate change. So first, with regards to extreme heat projections, by the year 2100, county residents could experience almost 2 full months each year with temperatures reaching above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Even by 2035, we can expect to experience an average of 12 days each year with temperatures reaching above 95 degrees, which is 3 times more than the county has experienced in our baseline years. And the baseline looks at the second half of the 20th century. With regards to extreme precipitation, when we look forward to the year 2100, the 100-year rain event for the year 2100 would be equivalent to as much as what is a 151-year event today. And more frequent recurring intervals, including the 1 year, 2 year, and 10-year storm events, are expected to have a somewhat smaller change in increased precipitation. This map shows the 10-year precipitation event for the year 2050. The red dots represent frequently flooded roads in the county, with the darker blue shaded areas of the map signifying the highest expected increases in nuisance or regular flooding. This information was combined with the Social Vulnerability Index, you can see those shaded areas, which shows the areas of the county that are considered to be the more vulnerable half of the county population. Combining the climate hazard data, the asset information, and the Social Vulnerability Index helps us to begin identifying the priority action areas. With regards to drought, mild drought conditions are projected to decrease or stay the same, but the annual risk of moderate, severe, and extreme drought is projected to increase significantly by the year 2100. To reduce the risks and the impacts associated with the county's primary climate hazards, the plan identifies 20 climate adaptation actions, and they include repairing and upgrading stormwater drainage and management systems, enhancing temperature and stormwater monitoring alerts, updating green streetscape and green infrastructure standards, hardening emergency shelters and installing resiliency hubs, and updating floodplain maps.
So the other part of the CAP is focusing on measuring and addressing greenhouse gas emissions in the county. And to do that, we start with the county's greenhouse gas inventory, which you see on the screen now. This is done with the assistance of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and they use what's called the U.S. Community Protocol to do this assessment. That measures the county's what are called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That's direct emissions within the county and emissions from the electric grid. And as you might expect, the two largest sources of emissions in the county are buildings and transportation. So starting from this, we look at what might be solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The next chart shows what we call a wedge diagram that has three main sections on it. The blue section reflects decarbonizing the electric grid. The orange sections represent actions to reduce transportation emissions, and the pink sections represent actions that would reduce building emissions. And in order to reach our goals of 80% reduction by 2027 and 100% reduction by 2035, you can see we have significant reductions to make in these three areas. So just talking about the strategies and the actions in each of these areas will shed some light on the things that we have included as recommended actions in the plan. So on the energy pathway, it's decarbonizing the electric grid. And that involves two major strategies. One is community choice energy, and the second is incentives and requirements related to the use of solar PV systems. We are looking at community choice energy because the state's renewable portfolio standard, which requires utilities to offer a certain percentage of the electricity they supply to be from renewable sources, only goes to 50% by 2030 right now under state law. And so we're trying to get to zero emissions by 2035. We need a greener grid than that. So community choice energy will hopefully give us the opportunity to become the electricity supplier to homes and small businesses in the county and offer cleaner electricity, hopefully at a cheaper price than current standard offer. We have a lot of studies to do to determine what the right price and mix is, but that's the goal. Decarbonizing the electric grid is very important because it factors into the emissions reductions in the other two sectors in transportation and building. And so on transportation, we have two major strategies. One is to shift the mode of how people travel, and the other is to make sure that people who are traveling in vehicles are driving in electric vehicles or riding in electric vehicles in the case of buses, for example. And again, it's important that the electricity that's used to charge those vehicles is from a clean source. So the actions on the transportation side on mode shift, we're looking at increasing public transportation options and also increasing the use of micromobility, things like walking and biking. And on the side of shifting people to electric vehicles, it's about incentives to encourage people to purchase electric vehicles, establishing a more robust charging system, infrastructure, and shifting public vehicles like buses to electric buses. On the building side, we focus on actions in both existing buildings and new buildings. For new buildings, we're looking at zero codes, which would require buildings to generate as much energy as they use on site. And for existing buildings, we're looking at things like building energy performance standards, which require existing buildings to meet certain minimum performance standards, electrifying buildings, and stopping the use of natural gas, which has greenhouse gas emissions. It's more efficient in the electric sector to produce electricity from gas than coal, but in a building, you want to try to get rid of all fossil fuels and electrify everything and use renewable electricity. So at the bottom of this chart, you see a wedge of gray items, a gray wedge there, and that's other emission sources, things like aviation, wastewater, refrigerants, where we haven't come up with specific strategies or actions yet. The CAP does talk about starting to measure those things and things we might be able to do, but those are not prominently discussed in the plan right now. We're focused on those three major sectors. The plan, one of the questions we've been asked by people is why don't you measure some of the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions? And these are what are called scope 3 emissions. And these include consumption emissions and embodied carbon emissions. Consumption emissions are the emissions that are associated with with the goods and materials that we use, the food we eat. There's emissions associated with all of those activities in some form or another. And generally those emissions are created outside the county. And so they're difficult to measure and difficult to control, or more difficult to measure and control than the emissions in the county. The other source of scope 3 emissions is embodied carbon emissions. This is the emissions, these are the emissions that result from the manufacture of steel, from concrete and other materials that go into making buildings. And a recent study by C40 Cities, which is a consortium of cities around the globe that are addressing climate change in a significant way, concluded that these emissions for high income areas, in their case cities, are significant, sometimes equal to or exceeding the scope 1 and 2 emissions that we measure in our inventory. So they are important to address, more difficult than the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but the CAP does begin to talk about how we can measure and reduce consumption in those areas. The plan does include 6 nature-based carbon sequestration actions focused around trees, wetlands, grasslands, increasing carbon retention in soils, and improving our agricultural practices so that our agricultural sector becomes more of a carbon sink. On each of the actions, both on the GHG emission side and the climate risk reduction side, in addition to looking at those primary benefits, we looked at co-benefits, things like public health, environmental stewardship, economic prosperity, and racial and social equity and social justice. And the CARP has lots of discussion and several graphs and figures that help people understand the impact of these co-benefits or the magnitude of these co-benefits, so that if people are interested, particularly, for example, in public health, they can look at those actions which not only address greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk reduction, but also have a positive impact on public health. We also look at feasibility criteria for each action, and this relates to the county's authority to do something, as well as the initial investment that's required by both the county and the private sector to implement the action. Some actions we have full authority to do, for example, making more stringent building codes. Other actions we require state legislation, for example, or perhaps even assistance from the federal government. Community choice energy is an example of something where we need state assistance. Right now, we are not able to offer community choice energy. There is a bill pending in the General Assembly that would give us the authority to do that.
The CAP includes 16 actions related to governance. This includes organizational structure and culture, staffing, technical capacity, as well as processes and decision-making, including key levers such as budgeting and procurement that will help to institutionalize climate change considerations and provide the foundation and capacity to implement the CAP. Public engagement, partnerships, and education. The success of the CAP is based largely on the degree to which community members are actively engaged and participating. And we feel we really need to rethink the way we've traditionally conducted outreach engagement. It can't just be one-way flow of information from county government to the community. And to create that resonance and spark broad scale action and truly support community members most vulnerable to the impacts from climate change, we need to co-create engagement efforts so that we're working with community-based organizations to amplify the voices of community members, particularly those who are most underrepresented, to really understand the set of issues in that chart we showed earlier, and the need to correct uneven power dynamics. We need to cultivate community-driven civic leadership and solutions, and build capacity by creating the organizational architecture to sustain the work. We're currently thinking through the concept of like a climate justice academy with fellows who are compensated. Again, it's just at the conceptual level, and this will take time to think through and require significant resources, but we feel we must move in this direction. And we recognize we need some technical expertise for this sort of non-conventional engagement effort. And we hope to get a request for proposal out on the street sometime this summer. We'd love any feedback from folks if you have any ideas about other jurisdictions that doing this sort of thing.
The CAP includes a number of other sections. It includes a robust list of actions that individuals, homeowners, renters, and businesses can take to reduce emissions and increase resilience. It also speaks to the Thrive Montgomery 2050 plan, which is the proposed new general plan for the county. The timing of the general plan update, which overlaps with the drafting of the CAP, enables these two major planning efforts to coordinate with and complement each other. The CAP also references the county's zero waste planning and initiatives, as well as those remaining emission sources, and begins to identify some potential reduction strategies for those sources. When it comes to paying for climate action, there are several important points that need to be highlighted. The first is that implementing many actions in the CAP will require substantial financial resources, and county government resources alone are not sufficient to fully implement the CAP. Implementing the actions in the plan calls for commitment from both public and private sectors while leveraging state and federal government resources. Because resources are constrained, the county will need to be creative in pursuing actions that provide multiple benefits. And finally, I want to underscore that while the costs of implementing the CAP are high, the cost of inaction on climate change will be even higher. While the climate plan is being finalized, the county is continuing to make progress on a number of initiatives. It includes advocating for a state bill on community choice energy. It's identified in the plan as a highly impactful action in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're also working to adopt the 2018 International Green Construction Codes. And DEP is working on legislation to develop a building energy performance standard for commercial and multifamily buildings. This is another action identified in the plan as being highly impactful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our Department of Transportation has launched and is in the process of launching a number of initiatives, including the recent service that just began with the Flash bus on US 29. Roughly a third of the plan's actions related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions are already underway or in a stage of development. However, implementing many CAP actions will require additional studies and analysis, developing new policies and programs, funding and innovative financing, tough conversations, and political support in cooperation at the local, state, and federal levels. And finally, we recognize that CAP actions may need to change as implementation begins and as more information and becomes available, as new technology becomes available, and that new actions may be required over time. So our approach will need to be flexible. There are a number of ways for the community to provide input on the draft CAP. On our climate website, the URL is listed here. There is a brief survey that we encourage you to fill out and let us know what you think about the plan. The survey is available in 7 languages. We also have the Climate Action Plan Art Contest. We're welcoming art entries and poems from residents of all ages in the county. And the winners will be featured in the final Climate Action Plan. We have also launched a virtual information room for the community to interact with the plan in a more kind of an experiential approach. And I'll have a screenshot of the virtual information room in the next slide to give you a sense of what I mean. For those of you who want to leave us more comments beyond the survey, you have our climate inbox here. We welcome your comments that way as well. And we have a number of virtual community sessions taking place in January and February. I want to highlight the Climate Youth Town Hall. It's scheduled for the evening of February 11th. It is primarily geared to high school and college age students from across the county. And it's an opportunity to hear their feedback on the draft cap, and also an opportunity for them to connect with each other on climate action. The public comment period for the cap is open through the end of February, and we anticipate releasing the final cap this spring. And I'll wrap by showing you an enticing screenshot of our virtual information room. When you get there, and you can get there by going to our climate webpage, it's basically a 360-degree experience. You can, virtually walk around this room. You can click on banners. You can click on the art galleries in the wall. There is even climate music that you can enjoy by some local musicians. So that concludes our presentation portion of the evening.
Thank you so much to Adriana, Stan, and Doug for answering our questions, for your presentation. And don't forget to comment before February 28th. Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
You.